Hi everyone, so today I'll be talking about the Fujifilm X-Pro2. Now I recently picked up the X-Pro2 as sort of a daily carry. It's good for street photography, it's good for trips and walking around, it's a nice size. So today I'll be talking about the Fuji X-Pro2 and comparing it to some of the other options that are available, including the Fuji X-T2 and also offerings from other brands as well. Now, if you're in the market for a mirrorless system, basically I think right now you have a choice of three systems which I think are really complete. The first one being Fuji, of course, and the other systems are Sony and Micro Four Thirds, so Olympus and Panasonic cameras. Now, of the three systems, the reason why I decided to go with Fuji is because I feel like Fuji offers the best balance between the different variables that I'm looking for when I'm shopping, including, for example, the lenses that are available, the quality of the bodies, price, and basically just the overall completeness of the system. Now, there are certain weaknesses to the Fuji system, which I'll go through later, but I want to talk about sort of the strengths and what I like about Fuji before I get onto the weaknesses. Now, of the three mirrorless systems, I feel like Micro Four Thirds is definitely the oldest and it's definitely the most complete. So it has the greatest number of lenses, it has the greatest number of bodies, considering both Panasonic, Olympus, and also now other manufacturers are making Micro Four Thirds bodies. So if you're looking for a system that has breadth, Micro Four Thirds does very well. But an area where I feel like Fuji has a genuine benefit over Micro Four Thirds is the quality of the lenses that are available. So right here I have the 23mm f2 on my X-Pro2, which is about the equivalent of a 35mm lens on full frame. Over here I also have a couple of other lenses, including this is the 56 f1.2. I've got the 18 to 55 f2.8 to f4 lens, so that's a zoom. And I've also got the 35 f2 lens. So basically I have what's the equivalent of a 35mm prime, a 50mm prime, and an 85mm prime, and I guess a pretty standard-ish zoom. So that's a good combination to have in terms of lenses, and it works really well. Now, on Micro Four Thirds, although you have sort of a lot of lenses, and sure, you have 35, 50, and 85 equivalent lenses, their lenses generally aren't as good quality as the Fuji lenses. There are some very good Micro Four Thirds lenses, such as the Panasonic Leica 42.5 f1.2, which is a good 85mm equivalent, arguably sharper than the Fuji 56mm. But the problem is those lenses are really expensive. So Fuji strikes the balance very well between quality, quantity, and also value. So that's why I decided to go with Fuji. Now the Fuji system is very complete. Now I know that the Sony system is also becoming increasingly complete every day, but again, the value proposition isn't as good for Sony. Their bodies are extremely expensive, such as their A7R2 and A7S2, even though they're very, very good cameras. And their lenses, although sharp, are also very expensive. For example, they recently released a Zeiss 50 f1.4, which is something like $2,000, which is, in my opinion, quite exorbitant. Their 24 to 70, for example, is more expensive than both the Canon and the Nikon equivalents. So that's something that I feel like is a weakness of the Sony system. But now let's come back around and focus specifically on the Fuji X-Pro2 and why I decided to go with this body instead of, say, the X-E2S or the X-T2. So Fuji has four lines of cameras, I guess, if you will. The first is the XA series, which is their budget-oriented series. Now, the latest one is the XA10. It has a nice flip-up screen that you can sort of use to take selfies like that. It doesn't have a viewfinder, which I feel is highly limiting, but at the same time, they're very cheap, they're very good value, and they offer very similar image quality to something like the Fuji, not the X-Pro2 because this has the newer sensor, but something like the Fuji X-T1, so the previous generation 16 megapixel bodies. Now they don't have an X-Trans sensor, they have a Bayer traditional type sensor, but I feel like it's very similar. It's it's not that much of a difference at the end of the day. So the XA series is a very good, I guess, gateway to the Fuji system, or it also serves as a good backup if you have something like the X-Pro2 and you're looking for something smaller that you can sort of use to take selfies and use on day outs. It's very, very good. Now, the next tier up, you have the the XE series. So the XE series is very similar in style to the X Pro. They're both rangefinder style cameras where you have the viewfinder in the top left. The XE series only has an electronic viewfinder, not the hybrid optical and electronic on the X Pro 2. The latest XE is the XE2S, which I think is a great camera. It's very similar to the previous generation XT1. It's got a similar autofocus system and so on and so forth. So it's a very good camera that sort of lags behind the latest X Pro 2 and XT2, but it's available for a very good price. Same with the XT10. Now, between the X Pro 2 and the XT2, which are Fuji's top cameras, I think the XT2 is the more utilitarian type camera where it does better on the specs. So it has a tilt articulating screen, which I really like. It has a bigger electronic viewfinder, which I think is extremely useful. And most importantly, I think it supports 4K video, which, you know, for some people might be a big deal if you regularly do video. The image quality is exactly the same because I use the same sensor, and with the latest firmware improvements, I feel like the autofocus performance on the X Pro 2 is very similar to that on the XT2. Now, there's a slight difference in the SD card slots. The XT2 has both UHS Type 2 card slots, whereas only one of the X Pro 2's card slots are the faster type. But for the most part, I don't feel like that's a big issue. I've never ran into buffer problems with the X Pro 2. Now, of course, with the XT2, you're able to attach a booster grip on the bottom, which improves its performance and allows it to shoot a higher number of frames per second. So it's more suitable for sports and the like. And with Fuji's new 100 to 400 super zoom, if you will, I think that the XT2 becomes a very viable option for sports. And of course, their older 50 to 140 f2.8 is excellent for indoor sports, where you're more pressed for light rather than distance. Now, the features that I like most about the X Pro 2 are its hybrid optical and electronic viewfinder. I shoot a lot of street photography, and in daylight, the optical viewfinder works a lot better than the electronic viewfinder because of how bright it is. The electronic viewfinder, however, tends to work better in the dark, so it's really a toss-up between what you prefer. I wish that the X Pro 2 had an articulating screen. That's definitely one of my biggest complaints. It's very hard to shoot down low. It's okay for up high because you can sort of see it more easily, but down very low, sometimes I think that having that articulating screen would have been really useful. The handling on the X Pro 2 is excellent, but the lack of the bigger grip, for example, as seen on the XT2, means that it's more suitable for smaller lenses such as these primes, rather than a big lens such as the 50 to 140. So I think that really goes to the heart of what Fuji is trying to achieve with the two bodies. The X Pro 2 is very much like a Leica. You use it with small primes, it's nice and compact, it carries well, it looks good, and it's a great camera for street shooting, for portrait shooting, and for other slower, more methodical type work. And I find that the X Pro 2 works great on portrait sessions, which I regularly shoot. The XT2, which I've also tested out, it works more like a DSLR. It's faster, it handles better, and it's more suitable for bigger and longer lenses. So perhaps if you shoot sports, or weddings, the XT2 is a tougher body, and it's also a better handling body, which is more suitable for that sort of work. The XT2 is a bit skinnier than the X Pro 2 and a bit taller than the X Pro 2. Now onto the things that I don't quite like about the Fuji system. Fuji's colors are great. I think they're very good colors for skin tones, but in terms of rendering, sometimes I find that the Fuji rendering isn't quite as good as the rendering that I get from my Canon cameras. So the Canon white balance is really spot on, especially for portraiture, whereas the Fujis are spot on 90% of the time, and 10% of the time they get pictures out that are a bit too green or too yellow. So perhaps like Nikon cameras, Fuji cameras tend to balance more towards the greens, whereas I feel Canon cameras tend to balance more towards the magentas and the reds. So it makes people feel a bit more lively, though I do think that the colors that you get out of Fuji and Nikon are better for landscapes. Now, of course, you can post-process all of this, but the natural tint that's there is sometimes very difficult to get rid of. Now, the other thing that I don't like about the X Pro 2, and I guess the Fuji system in general, is that it uses an APS-C type sensor. Now, a lot of people are happy with APS-C, but having shot a lot on full frame, there are a lot of benefits that are available on full frame. For example, being able to generate a more shallow depth of field. So for example, with this 56mm f1.2, which is an 85mm equivalent, it only really gets the same depth of field as an 85 f1.8, okay? So, you know, it's a great lens and it's sharp, But if you're looking to get really shallow depth of field, for example, something you can get with the Canon 85mm f1.2L, then it's not quite as good in that regard. But perhaps the more subjective thing, and this is not objective here, the more subjective thing that I feel like is a weakness is that the smaller sensors tend to render a bit more flat. So when you get an image on the, say, the 5D Mark III, there's more of a 3D pop to the image than the X-Pro2. Now, maybe that's because of the shallow depth of field you can get, giving you better depth perception. But I also think that with the smaller pixel pitch that's available in the X-Pro2, it doesn't quite capture the image quite the same way as, say, a larger 5D Mark III. So people talk about, say, the medium format look or the full frame look. That's really what I'm talking about here. I do think that the rendering is generally more pleasant and more 3D-like and less flat on something like the 5D Mark III. If you look at a lot of images, not side by side, but just generally speaking, you'll probably be able to see that the ones captured on a bigger sensor do tend to have a more pleasing rendering to them. Of course, ISO performance is great on all modern cameras, but it's not as good as on a full frame, and that's to be expected because it's a smaller area, capturing less light. But Fuji does very well at high ISOs, even though they tend to blur out the noise quite a bit, giving you the waxy skin effect, which I personally don't like. But I think that, that as long as you stick to, for example, ISO 6400, it works very well. So in conclusion, what do I think about the X-Pro2? It's an expensive camera, there's no doubt about that. For the same price as an X-Pro2, I could have picked up a Nikon D750 or a Canon 6D, both of which are technically superior cameras. They have full frame sensors, they have access to a much wider variety of lenses, but they're also much bigger. So in many senses, you do pay quite a fair bit for having a small advanced camera such as the Fuji X-Pro2. It's expensive, but that's the price you have to pay for getting something that's good looking and something that you can carry around all day. The lenses that you can get from Fuji are excellent. So for example, this 56 f1.2 is about $1,000, and I think it's really good. Now, if you compare that to something that's available on, say, a Canon or a Nikon system, I do think there are certain weaknesses. The fact that there's only Fuji lenses available on Fuji is a huge weakness. So something like, for example, let's say this 23mm f2 that I have on here, I paid the same amount for this as I did for the Sigma 35 f1.4 Art in Canon mount. Now I know I got the Sigma for a very good price, but you know, that's an f1.4 on a full frame, whereas this is an f2 on an APS-C, which is the equivalent of around about an f2.8. So you see, you're getting two effective more stops of light out of the f1.4 lens. So that's something that you probably should consider as well. Now, all up, what do I think about my decision to purchase the Fujifilm X-Pro2? I think it's been great. I've taken a lot of great images with the X-Pro2, and I think if you decide that this is the sort of camera you want, this is the form factor you're looking for, and this is the look that you like, and the lenses suit what you want, then I also think you'll be able to make a lot of great images with the X-Pro2. I've been very happy with how it works, and despite its flaws, I still think that it's a very good camera. So between the X-Pro2 and the X-T2, I do think that if I had my time again, I might have chosen the X-T2, but the look of the X-Pro2 is undeniably good. Its controls are very mechanical and tactile, and I love it. And all up, I do think that the X-Pro2 is a great camera, albeit expensive, with a great lens lineup and also good features to boot. Thanks for tuning in, and in the next episode, I'll be talking about a couple of the Fuji lenses that I have here. So we're reviewing the 56, the 35, and the 23. And we'll be taking a look at why I decided to get those lenses and why I think they're the best Fuji lenses that are available. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.